Welcome to the 9th day of the 3rd season of the 12 Days of Celtic Mythology. This year, we're looking at the voyages of two different kings, both called Bran. If you've just wandered in, pull up a chair. If nothing makes sense, there's a link to a playlist where you can start at day 1, and you might find that preferable. You can find that at the end of this video. It looks like a couple of people might have dropped out of the challenge. So it might be worth checking that your comments are all there for, say, the last 2 or 3 days, because I was surprised that a couple of people missed. I'd advise you to leave a late comment rather than lose out. So there are already a few late comments. I'm not sure what I'll do about all that, but just don't give up. Yes. Okay. So some of these people are people I'm in contact with. You might be my student or you might be in the live discussion group, but I'm trying not to play favorites. So you'll need to get that information here. Contestants, check your comments for the last 3 days in case one of them hasn't stuck or something. We had an interesting discussion in the live group yesterday about Evnissyen and the horses. There was some discussion about what horses symbolize. And I definitely think that's relevant to the story. And closer to the end of the series, I'll talk about that. But that led to a discussion about the difference between symbolism and meaning. So the question I asked yesterday was primarily about Evnissyen's motivations, as opposed to what horses symbolize. There may be a reason relevant to the inner workings of the story, to the plot line, as to why Evnissyen did what he did, to an underlying message in the story that's part of the narrative, right? Even though it's no excuse for what he did. So symbolism is great, but I don't like to just treat a myth like a tarot spread or something. I talked about this a bit recently in the Cauldrons series. Symbols aren't necessarily stable. A cauldron might symbolize a womb in one story, but kingship and hospitality in another story. A horse might symbolize sovereignty, or it might symbolize power or status or virility. So, as I said, they can sometimes distract us, symbols can, from the inner workings of the story. But let's get to today's story now. We've been hearing about a Welsh king called Bran, or Bendigeidfran, to give him his full name, who is styled as King of the Island of the Mighty, in other words, of Britain. He agreed to give his sister Branwen as a wife to Matholwch, the King of Ireland. But Bran's half-brother, Evnissyen, he went a bit nuts and decided to slash up all the horses belonging to Matholwch and his men. This created a bit of a family feud that's about to escalate into an international incident, as they used to say. As we join them, Bran and Matholwch have managed to patch things up for the time being, partly due to a magical cauldron given by Bran. On the second night of feasting, Bran and Matholwch were sitting together, and Matholwch asked about the origins of the cauldron Bran had given him the night before. Oh, it was given to me by a man from your own country. What man was that? Asked Matholwch. Well, it was a fellow called Hlasar, Bran replied. Hlasar hlaid give you it. He and his wife, Camidai Camainvoth, said that they escaped from an iron house in Ireland. It had been made white hot around them, they said. Did you ever hear of that? Oh, I have indeed, said Matholwch. I'll tell you the whole story. I was out hunting one day, and I was standing atop a tumulus, looking down on a lake we have there called the Cauldron Lake. And I saw a big ruddy-haired man coming out of the lake with a cauldron on his back. He looked untrustworthy. In fact, he looked monstrous. There was a woman following behind him, and as big as the man was, she must have been twice his size. After we greeted each other, he told me that the woman would soon become pregnant and that she would give birth within 6 weeks, and that she would not give birth to a babe, but to a fully armed warrior. Well, I took them in and I fed them, and everything was fine for about a year. But in time, they made themselves very unwelcome and everyone hated them. They were rude. They began to harm the noblemen and the noblewomen. The people rebelled and said they would depose me if I didn't get rid of them. Well, we held a council and we could see that it was going to be difficult to rid ourselves of them because they were so strong. So this is what we did. We called all the smiths together and we forged a chamber of solid iron. And we invited the man and woman who now had many children into this house to feast. We provided food and a great amount of drink inside the house. And once they were drunk, we shut them in and piled lighted coals all over the iron house. And the smiths plied their bellows until it was white hot. Through their superior strength, the man and woman broke through the side of the house before they were cooked. But the children didn't escape. Now I see that they must have come over here to you, Lord. They did, said Bran, and straight away they gave me the cauldron. How have you managed to have them here without trouble? Asked Matholwch. I've scattered them all about the kingdom, said Bran, and they've bred many strong fighters in every place I've found them. Best warriors I've ever seen. Well, it was a good celebration that night. The gloom had lifted, and they sang and talked until sleep seemed better than waking, so they went to bed. Finally, Matholwch and Branwen departed for Ireland. There was great joy at their arrival, and Branwen gave generous gifts of jewels to all the nobles who came to visit her. In the first year, Branwen was highly honored. She made many friends. In time, she fell pregnant and gave birth to a son. He was named Gwern, son of Matholwch. As was the custom for a king's son, he was placed in the very best place of fosterage in Ireland. But after that, a faction stirred up the memory of Matholwch's humiliation in Wales and the harm that was done to the horses. His foster brothers and close associates began to mock him. Things were moving toward an uprising as people demanded that vengeance be taken against the people of Britain. Branwen was driven from the king's chamber and sent to the kitchen to bake, and the promise kept that the butcher would come to her daily after he'd been tearing up meat and box her ears. And that was the vengeance they took. Matholwch was warned by his counselors to prevent any vessel from traveling to Wales. If any arrived from Wales, their crews were imprisoned for fear of word reaching Bendigeidfran. Oof, poor Branwen will have to wait until tomorrow to find out whether her fortunes improve. My question today is about Matholwch. What do you think of his character? Is he a good king? Do you see a pattern that recurs with Matholwch? I want to talk a little bit more today about reading the Mabinogi and some of the things that are said in the Mabinogi stories that might seem strange to you and what they're doing there and what's going on. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that can help you understand the Mabinogi. So one thing is the pre-Norman law codes of Wales. I know you probably don't feel very excited about reading up on that, but the laws of early Ireland and Wales are probably the best window we have on the customs and preoccupations of the time. There are constant references to them in the mythological texts of both countries, if you know how to recognize them. Then there are bits of what we might call lore keeping in these stories. They seem to be like little nodes in the narrative that connect to something else. It was probably part of how the court storytellers remembered the many things they were required to know, and perhaps allowed them to pause in the story to insert another related story if they wished to. So 2 of these nodes are references to the triads of Britain and place name lore. Now, we've already seen examples of all 3 things in the action of our story. In Wales, the law codes were often called the laws of Hwyl Dda. He was a king who ordered that the laws that had already been in use for many centuries be recorded in writing and properly codified. In Ireland, the equivalent is sometimes called the Brehon laws. The Brehon Law texts are much more extensive than what we have for Wales, but Wales has enough to show us that what was, going on. I'll put some links in the notes today to websites where you can have a look, but honestly, Google and Wikipedia will probably be golden as well. You may remember that when Bran sends the message to Matholwch when he's about to leave after his horses have been attacked, that he offers him a rod of silver and a golden plate. This is how it looks in the text. Tell him he will get a healthy horse for each one of his that are ruined. And together with that, as an honor payment, he will get a silver rod as thick as his little finger and as tall as himself, and a gold plate as broad as his face. So I present to you the laws of Ulva. This has been talking about what will happen if a king is insulted. For such an insult to the king, 100 cows shall be paid on account of every 100 of the kingdom, and a silver rod with 3 knobs at top that shall reach from the ground to the king's face when he sits in his chair, and as thick as his ring finger, and a golden bason which shall hold fully as much as the king drinks, of the thickness of a husbandman's nail, in other words, a worker's fingernail, a farm worker's fingernail, who shall have followed husbandry for 7 years. So as thick as a mature man's probably thumbnail, the gold has to be at least that thick. It can't be some flimsy thing. So this golden bason, it's like a cross between a cup and a bowl. And it must have a golden cover as broad as the king's face, equally thick as the bason. So the death of the king would be compensated at 3 times as much as is paid for an insult to him, by triple augmentation. Both Ireland and Wales had what we call restorative justice rather than punitive justice before the Normans changed everything. So if you caused harm, you had to pay compensation for that harm. And the value of most things was codified from a king's life right down to the household cats and kittens. And if you had no money, your kin would be liable for what you owed. They would be looking for your brothers and cousins. And I'm sure this did wonders for people keeping their more wayward family members in line. There are also many things which are both customs and codified in the law. Everything from marriage contracts to fostering out children. So these foster children you keep hearing about aren't orphans. It's more like sending them to boarding school, not exactly, but it's a way for different families, noble families, to network with each other, and for boys especially to grow up in a cohort of close friends who are also noble. So the nobility of Ireland and Wales didn't raise their own children. There was no nuclear family. That's really hard for people to even imagine now. Boys might not meet their father until they were 15 and ready to go to war. So I cover a lot of this in a short video, which I'll link at the end. It's called something like Surprising Facts About Life in the Mabinogi. The Triads of Britain, now they're a collection of things which are similar, such as 3 similar events or 3 people with a similar quality or something. These help storytellers remember stories, and very often these are quoted within stories as well. So you might have noticed that Branwen was referred to as one of 3 special women. Well, first thing the next day, this is when Matholwch has just arrived. First thing the next day, they took counsel. The decision they made was the giving of Branwen to Matholwch. She was one of the 3 high matriarchs of this island. I think when I told the story, I called her chief ladies or great ladies, one of the 3 great ladies of the island. We can see down below other translators. John Ballard has called her one of the 3 chief maidens. Shauna Davis has called her one of the 3 chief forebears, but you get the general idea. So she was one of the 3 high matriarchs of this island and the most beautiful maiden in the world. He was to sleep with her at Aberfrau, and they set out thence. The retinues also set off towards Aberfrau. Matholwch and his retinues by ship, Bendigeidvran and his host by land until they reached Aberfrau. So this is obviously referring to a triad, the three chief matriarchs of the island of Britain. But the triad, although it's quoted in the story, it doesn't seem to exist anymore. There's no sign of it in any texts that we have. So we'll look at another one from the second branch, which does still exist in a moment. But there are some other interesting things in this passage concerning laws and customs. Matholwch was to sleep with Branwen at Aberfrau. Even for many centuries after Christianity, there was no such thing as a wedding ceremony overseen by a priest or in a church. These statements about the sleeping together at the wedding suggests that there was nothing like that in the pre-Christian Celtic world either. So there was no druid standing with the couple in front of him while he waved his wand around and hand-fasted them. Sorry. That's a modern pagan adaptation of a Christian custom. The main ingredients of a marriage were agreeing a contract between the two families, bride price, dowry, however it went. Then there would be a big feast, which might go on for many days. During the feast, the couple would ceremonially consummate the marriage. Now, when I say ceremonially, I don't mean symbolically. They actually had sex, and there would be observers or witnesses to this to make sure that everything was working as it should. This way, neither party could later claim that the marriage had not been consummated. What fun. It's exactly like breeding livestock. You don't just take a guy's word for it that his bull has covered your cow. You stand and watch. How romantic. Maybe it's time to move on. There's one last thing here. So we see this mention of retinues. A retinue is like the king's personal army, if you like, his little standing army. And at the beginning of the story, Matholwch arrives with 13 ships laden with men and horses. No doubt he would have also brought a pile of expensive gifts, although the story doesn't mention it. Some folk in the live session yesterday wondered whether this was a threatening gesture on Matholwch's part. I wasn't able to find a reference to quote it on the screen, but I've read this more than once, that at least in some periods, it was against the law for an Irish king to leave his territory. Remember, there were all these little territories and kings without his retinue. So he had to travel with his fighters. So Matholwch's retinue would have been huge. The idea within Ireland, where there were all these kings and sub-kings, was that it was better to keep your king as safe as possible, because them being taken hostage or assassinated was a very real possibility. I mean, have you read Macbeth? And that just caused instability when kings got themselves killed. So it was part of the king's responsibility not to put himself in danger. So Matholwch turning up with his personal army is completely normal. It's not a threatening gesture. Now, that triad I mentioned, triad number 53, the three harmful blows of the island of Britain. That's kind of how they all go. The first of them, Matholwch the Irishman, struck upon Branwen, daughter of Llŷr. And the second, Gwynhwyfach, struck upon Gwynhwyvar. For that cause there took place afterward the action of the Battle of Camlan. So Gwynhwyvar is Guinevere, right? Okay, so apparently she's got an opposite with a similar name who slapped her, and this is why the Battle of Camlan took place. And the third, Golaiden the poet, struck upon Cadwallader the Blessed. Don't know what these stories are about, but there you go. So let's look at Rachel Bromwich's notes to this triad, because it's kind of interesting. So polvout, she says, this is the word that's being used for blow in the Middle Welsh. Yes, that is Welsh, but it's Middle Welsh. That's why it looks so strange. So polvout, literally a hand slap. So polv is like the Latin palm, the palm of the hand, as opposed to dearnout, a blow with the fist. So the reference here shows that the details differed slightly from those in the extant Mabinogi. It was Matholwch's cook and not Matholwch himself. Actually, it was Matholwch's butcher, I think, but anyway, who struck Branwen. Moreover, the blow was not an isolated deed, but was repeated daily. It's more likely that the triad is based on the tale of Branwen in an oral form, which differed in points of detail from the story that has come down. So if you remember, I just told you how she was sent to the kitchen to bake, and every day the butcher came in after he'd been tearing up meat and boxed her ears. But obviously there's been a version of the story where it's Matholwch who strikes her. So the place name lore that we've seen in the second branch is this. This is the paying of the honor price to Matholwch. The next day, the horses were paid to him to be kept as long as tame horses last. I think this means, as long as domestic horses live, which is a long time, until the tally was complete in his eyes. And they journeyed with him into another commot, and this commot was thereafter known as Tal Ebolion. Now, tal in Welsh means payment, and ebol means foal. So the payment of the foals. Shauna Davis, in her notes to the Mabinogion, has this to say: don't worry that the spelling of Tal Ebolion is slightly different. It's nothing to worry about. First of all, she says it's a commot in Anglesey. And here we have an attempt, she says, albeit incorrect, to explain the place name. The Welsh tal, meaning payment, but also end. And ebolion means foals, but it also means hollows or ridges. Hence, payment of the foals, but the original meaning was probably tal ebolion, the far end of the hollows or ridges. So a name describing the landscape. Now, Shauna Davis is probably correct here. She's certainly correct about the two meanings of the two words, and it does sound like it could be describing the landscape. That information is useful to us, but in cases like this, from the point of view of understanding the context, what people believed about the place name is sometimes more significant than what it really means originally. It tells us a lot about how people are engaging with myth and with landscape. So the Irish have a huge body of place name lore called the Dinhenicus. And these are a gold mine of myths that don't appear anywhere else. There isn't a formal collection of Welsh texts which is equivalent, but the Cyfarwyddiaid, the class of storytellers in Wales, who are a bit different than the bards, maybe a little overlapping, but usually pretty separate. Cyfarwyddiaid, the class of storytellers, they were a special kind of learned men. Originally, they kept things like land boundaries and contracts, presumably in their heads, but then later undoubtedly in writing. But as a result of this, they knew a lot of local lore. They would be out on the land talking to people all the time, right? And also had legal and genealogical knowledge, so that they were a kind of lore keeper, a bit separate from the bards. So that's it for today. 3 more days to go, and then we can all have a 24-hour rest before the Intro to Celtic Mythology class starts. And that if that's the class you intend to take and you're in the challenge, or even if you're intending to pay for it, do get in touch soon, because that way I can get you sorted out and ready to go. So I hope to see a lot of you there. Bye-bye for today. Celtic mythology, where do you begin? How do you keep all those names straight? And how do you pronounce them? So here you are, trying to learn about Celtic mythology. You've tried looking online, but all the answers are different. It's hard to know which information is trustworthy. Maybe you bought a few books and the result hasn't been as good as you'd hoped. You didn't quite find what you were looking for, and then some know-it-all told you that your books were wrong anyway. Hang in there, help is at hand. But I'll be honest with you, Celtic mythology is a big topic. You can't learn it all from one book or one website. You can't learn it all in a month or even a year. Maybe you're past that beginner stage. You feel like you've found some good resources, but it's still hard to progress. Maybe you've spent a lot of time on one area, a particular set of stories or a deity that you're interested in, but all the names and the jargon are still confusing. You're not sure how one thing relates to another. You've been in the weeds, you've been in the trees, now you need to get organized. I've got a new class starting soon called Introduction to Celtic Mythology. Whether you're an absolute beginner or someone who's been exploring for a while, this should give you a good foundation to build on. My aim is to give people a clear understanding of what Celtic myth actually is, where it comes from, and a good, solid overview of all the ingredients. This is a 12-week course. About half of it is dedicated to material from Wales and half to Ireland. Part of what I'll be teaching is how the different stories and groups of stories are usually organized, so that things are less of a jumble for you. Then we'll learn about what's in some of the most famous or most important stories, who some of the main characters are, and what the story is about. I'll also make sure that you're building up skills so that when the class ends, you're well equipped to do your own further research. Every week, I'll be featuring a book and a website that I find useful, including some tricks for finding what you're actually looking for on the internet. I always send out a PDF of notes after my classes, and you can expect them to be full of useful links. That will include links for further reading or videos, and links to where you can find proper translations of most of the stories. And speaking of stories, I know people want stories. It's why we like mythology, after all. So there will be a bit of storytelling every week, and of course, you'll get a link to where you can read the original text that it came from. This will be a lot to pack into the course, but I will make sure that there's time set aside every week to answer your questions. You don't need any prior knowledge of Celtic myth or Celtic languages for this class. I'll start with the most basic basics, and we'll build from there. By the end, I think you'll be surprised at how much you've learned, and you should have a nice, clear understanding of things. There's more information at the link below this video.